Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Florida Springs Council's August webinar. Today, we are going to be focusing on the Santa Fe River minimum flow and level draft regulatory strategy. That's a mouthful, but we're going to break it down for you and hopefully help you all write some public comments to DEP expressing the need for a stronger, more protective role. But before we do that, I'm really happy to have our communications guru, Chloe Doherty, here with me. And Chloe is going to walk us through the Springs news, including some breaking stuff that just came out today. So take it away, Chloe.
Thank you, Ryan. So some Springs news updates. FSE is continuing our partnerships with the University of Florida Law School and Stetson Law School's environmental clinics. We are continuing to explore legal options to continue to protect Florida's waters when our state agencies fail to do so. We have ongoing partnerships with both schools' environmental clinics, and the students provide valuable insight and work for the basis of much of our legal work. So as the new school year begins, we are starting to meet with the law schools again and look forward to those partnerships. And we also look forward to our continued partnership with Stetson Law School, who is the host of, along with the Florida Springs Council, of the upcoming Springs Summit. And so the Spring Summit, every 2 years, the Florida Springs Council gathers Springs advocates from across the state together for a Springs Summit. This is an opportunity for seasoned experts and Springs advocates to come together in the interest of protecting and restoring Florida Springs and learning and networking together. It's a free event, and registration just opened this week, so you can register at floridaspringscouncil.org/summit, and I encourage you all to do so. And we are so thankful for our partners this year and our sponsors, including title sponsor Save the Manatee Club. This week and this month, FSC is also working on digging into the 2024-2025 Springs Restoration Project proposals, which are available to review on the Department of Environmental Protection's website. FSC each year analyzes the list to follow the money and understand if Springs restoration funding will be spent on cost-effective and meaningful projects. So stay tuned for more information on that, and you can dig into the projects as well and find that list on DEP's website. Each year we find pretty much the same story of the projects that are proposed are for costly infrastructure projects rather than addressing the largest source of pollution, which we know is agriculture. And getting into some of that breaking news Ryan was mentioning, today we unfortunately found out about some terrifying proposed changes to 9 state park management plans. This includes 3 golf courses proposed at Jonathan Dickinson State Park and several other concerning proposals for changes to other state parks across Florida, including resorts, as well as other non-conservation developments. So this is something we are continuing to look into, and it's very concerning proposals. DEP did not give a lot of time or information regarding these projects, and they're holding public meetings only next Tuesday. So we're frustrated with this process and these projects as well. So we will continue to provide information as we learn more, but those are something that we just found out about today. And we know, again, that the answer to healthier springs is preserving more forests and state parks. And so these, we don't want to see our state parks sold off to the highest bidder and turned into sources of pollution. So Ryan, that is all the information I have. If you want to come back on, and look forward to learning more about the writing comment letters and the MFL regulatory strategy.
Thank you so much, Chloe. All right, and I forgot the housekeeping part. If we're on live right now on Facebook and YouTube, you can submit questions through Facebook and YouTube. We will get them. We want questions to be a big part of this webinar because really we're trying something a little bit different here. What we want to do is provide you all with the information you need to write effective comment letters to DEP. We know from our experience challenging the Seven Springs Nestle permit that, right or wrong, DEP does not consider form letters, quote unquote, to be substantive comments, and they're more or less discarded when you send them in, at least on these types of proposed rules. I don't think that's as true with legislative stuff, but certainly on these proposed rules. So we want to give you all the information to be able to write those letters. Some of this stuff is complicated, unfortunately. We wish it wasn't, but the big picture here really isn't. We've had a law on the books since 2016 that requires DEP to protect our outstanding Florida springs. And instead of doing that, they've delayed and delayed and delayed and are now proposing weak rules that will benefit developers, will benefit polluters, will benefit our largest water users at the expense of the Santa Fe River and our springs. So I really encourage everyone, as you go, please put questions into the chat box. We're going to have a healthy time for Q&A at the end of this whole thing. And hopefully we will be able to help you all write more effective comment letters, both on this and on other issues going forward. So please use that question and answer box. All right. So this is a little bit of what we're going to cover today. We're going to look at what is the current status of the Santa Fe. We're going to talk about what an MFL is, what a recovery strategy is, why does the Santa Fe need one. We're going to look at the timeline, concerns about the actual MFL, and then we're going to walk through the recovery strategy. I want to make a point that this is still a proposed draft. This is not the final document, which gives us a lot of time to work on this. DEP does not plan to adopt something until at least 2026, which is a problem in and of itself, but also gives us a chance to make sure that we get a stronger, more effective plan. Then we're going to kind of lay out our major concerns, take your questions, and give you whatever tips we can to write effective letters. All right, let's get going. Next slide. So the main problem with the Santa Fe River, and the reason that it even needs an MFL, is that the Santa Fe River flow has been declining. And you can see it there in that slide where we were back in 1975, over 1,800 cubic feet per second. And now we are down below 1,000 cubic feet per second. And the change is largely from pumping. So what we're trying to, what this rule is trying to address, and what we're trying to address, is to get that flow back up to where it should have been, had the districts and DEP done their job in the consumptive use permit by not over allocating the water resources. Next slide. One important thing to note is that while state law differentiates between water quality and water quantity, with the districts largely dealing with water quantity and DEP largely dealing with water quality, the two things are inextricably linked. When you think about water quality, it's a concentration. We measure water quality in milligrams per liter. So, half of that is the milligrams. That's the amount of pollution that's coming out of the springs. But the other half of that is the flow. And while I would never say that the solution to pollution is dilution, the truth is that the Santa Fe, Sewanee, and some of our other spring systems are so incredibly polluted, especially the ones that have a primarily agricultural pollution, that there really is no way to fix these springs without also restoring the flow. We're going to have to tackle it from both sides. So when we talk about MFLs, this isn't just the flow, but this is the water quality. This is the algae. And there's more and more research showing that, the declines in flow really allow the nitrogen to have the really negative consequences on our springs, to create the algae, to kill off the submerged aquatic vegetation, all the things that make our springs great. So it's all one system. The state can divide it however they like to make it easier to get around the rules. But in reality, we know these two things are very connected, and that we have to restore flow in order to improve water quality. So what is a minimum flow and level? And from now on, I'm going to call these MFLs. MFLs are the point at which further withdrawals would be significantly harmful to the water resources or ecology of the area. So significantly harmful, right? That's a high standard. In theory, no consumptive use permit should be able to cause harm. Yet in a death by 1,000 cuts kind of scenario, we've created a situation where, although we've never approved a permit that causes harm, we have caused significant harm to the river system. So these are really, our last stand if we want to protect these rivers. And when it comes to outstanding Florida Springs and outstanding Florida spring-fed rivers, we have extra rules about MFLs. So for OFS, if a spring is determined to be violating its MFLs, DEP or the Water Management District is required to adopt a recovery strategy to achieve the MFL in no more than 20 years. So whenever they adopt a rule, that's when that clock starts ticking. Recovery strategies can include water reservations, permit restrictions, water conservation requirements, and alternative water supply and resource development projects. While all of those things can be included, they're not all included, and they're certainly not equal when it comes to protecting our springs. So what is a recovery strategy? A recovery strategy is our very last resort to save springs and rivers already suffering significant harm from overpumping. There's nothing after this. If the MFL recovery strategy does not work, that means that our springs and rivers will not be restored, and we will continue to see them in the sad shape that unfortunately many of them are in today. Recovery strategies are only necessary because water management districts and DEP have refused to follow the law in issuing water use permits. We've done an analysis looking back at the last 10 years, and we can't find a permit that's been denied because of the harm that it would cause to one of these springs or rivers, despite the fact, again, that the state is telling you that these rivers are suffering significant harm. The Santa Fe and Ichetucknee have been in violation of their MFLs since before 2015 and have had an adopted recovery strategy since 2015. As I said, despite that, we haven't denied a single permit, and while they've changed the metrics a little bit to make the comparisons harder, these springs and rivers are still in recovery, which means that we have not fixed the problem. Since 2016, DEP has been required to adopt new rules to protect outstanding Florida springs from harmful water withdrawals. If DEP had adopted these rules, if they had followed the law, which they refused to do, we wouldn't need this recovery plan. It would be completely unnecessary because we would be addressing the harm the consumptive use permits are causing in the permitting process, which is how the law is designed. Unfortunately, because of agency capture, because of a refusal to follow the rules, because of modeling, we have not been able to effectively manage consumptive use permits, making the MFO recovery strategy that we're talking about today necessary. The Florida Springs and Aquifer Protection Act is that law I was just talking about. It was passed in 2016. And when we talk about the timeline, that law could not be more clear. I think that one of the things the legislature was really trying to get across to our agencies is not to do exactly what they've done and wait years, really decade, to take action to protect our springs. So the law requires that MFLs and recovery strategies require immediate action and calls on DEP to expeditiously adopt a recovery or prevention strategy. DEP was required to adopt a new MFL and recovery strategy by the end of 2019. So every year, the water management districts are required to list their top priorities. Like what's the one, what are your number one priority, number two priority, number three priority for adopting MFLs and recovery plans? You can go back and look, and every year since 2019, the Santa Fe River MFL has been the number one priority. Yet here we are talking about it in 2024 with DEP looking at a 2026 adoption date. So a decade after the state said you must expeditiously adopt these plans, DEP has done nothing. Next slide. So here's a little look at how they've kicked the can down the road. And this is really important. This isn't just an opportunity to say the DEP is not doing a good job. As I said, the law says that you have to restore the springs within 20 years of adoption of the MFL. So every year the DEP waits to adopt the MFL is a year later that we will have restored springs. So I won't walk through all of these, but I think the real key ones that we haven't covered is, in 2020, they really began this effort that they should have finished in 2019. by developing the new MFLs and putting them forward before peer reviewers. It took 4 years between having that MFL and those peer review reports to where we are today, actually seeing a draft recovery plan. And we still have potentially 2 years to go before we'll see anything adopted. Next slide. Okay, so now issues with the MFL. So this is not the recovery strategy, but this is the actual MFL that the recovery strategy is based on. The MFLs are based on 3 points in the river. So essentially, the districts in DEP have gauges at 3 points, 2 in the Santa Fe and 1 at the Ichetucknee River, that they use to determine whether or not the rivers are meeting their minimum flow. However, the law requires MFLs for the springs. And as we know, MFLs for the rivers and MFLs for the springs are not the same thing. Alachua County, which has been a great partner in this effort, actually hired Dr. Sam Upchurch, a renowned hydrogeologist, to look at the MFLs developed. And he found that the MFLs show little understanding of specific springs and resurgences and do not adequately protect the springs. And I think we should be very concerned that our state agencies that are in charge of protecting the springs, when an expert reviews their work, finds that they don't even understand them. More concerning, the actual status of those river MFL compliance points and flow deficits are based on out-of-date data, while state law requires that they are based on the best available information. So right now, the agencies are working with data that's 3 or 4 years old, which will be 5 or 6 years old by the time they actually get around to adopting these plans. Next slide. So this is a map of the Santa Fe River Basin. On the right-hand side, you'll see what we call the upper Santa Fe Basin. And on the left-hand side, you'll see what we call the lower Santa Fe and Ichetucknee River Basin. What we're talking about today is that left part of the map, the lower Santa Fe. And for anyone who's like, well, hey, I don't live on the Santa Fe, what we've seen in the past is that whatever the first rule DEP adopts is, that's going to be the rule that we see for our other springs. So if you're in Wakaiva, if you're in Wakulla, if you're in Rainbow, Silver, if you're in any other spring basin, this is really a look ahead at what you can be expecting, when DEP finally gets around to doing your springs, which they should have done by now. To begin with. But you can see those 3 orange triangles. Those are the 3 compliance gauges. There's one at Highway 441, there's one in Fort White, and there's one on the Ichetucknee River. Because the nature of the river and springs, having a gauge in the river does not necessarily protect the springs. Under state law, we still need those riverine MFLs, but we need them to be supplemented by individual MFLs for all of the outstanding Florida springs, because you could clearly be meeting the MFL with one of these river compliance points while still violating what would be the MFL at an outstanding Florida spring. And that is what the law was designed to stop. Next slide. So this is DEP's 2022 MFL status assessment. The key point here is that we have 2 of our 3 gauges that are found to be in recovery. I think that you could have issues with the lower Santa Fe Fort White gauge and saying that it's meeting the MFL. The MFL was lowered for that gauge. If it had not been lowered as part of this review, it would also be in prevention. But they did lower it. But we have 2 that are very much in recovery, lower Santa Fe and Ichetucknee. And as you can see, the lower Santa Fe gauge is currently 1 cubic feet per second net flow below its MFL, while the Ichetucknee is 6.3 cubic feet per second below its MFL. And if you add in the projected water use impacts, you can see that that 441 gauge becomes 17 cubic feet per second below its MFL, while the Ichetucknee drops to 13 cubic feet per second below its MFL. Next slide. So the way that we're going to get in a little more to the rule, the recovery strategy. So what you're looking at here is something that is called the North Florida Regional Water Supply Area. This is basically the areas that could potentially have an impact on the springs of the Santa Fe River and the Ichetucknee River. Every consumptive use permit within this area will be evaluated to determine its impact at those recovery points that we showed you last slide. Next. All right, so now we're going to get into the draft rule. Again, some of this gets complicated, but feel free to ask questions. We'll try to make it as simple as we can. For the draft rule, DEP is breaking all water uses down into 3 categories. The first category is existing uses. So this is actual water use in effect between 2014 and 2018. It's an average of those uses. So any permit that was operating during that time, they're going to take the average of those uses, and that is considered to be the existing use. The new uses are divided up into 2 categories. Group A is new uses that occur between 2019 and whenever this rule is adopted. And Group B is new uses that occur after the effective date. To understand the rule, one of the things you have to understand is that a new use does not actually have to be a new permit. So let's say that we had a utility that was pumping 1 million gallons a day on average from 2014 to 2018. And then beginning in 2019, they moved that pumping up to 1.2 million gallons per day. The 1 million gallons per day is considered an existing use. The extra 200,000 gallons per day would be considered a new use Group A, and they would be dealt with different. For Group B, the same situation. Let's say that utility pumped 1 million gallons a day from 2014 to 2018. And then, in 2026, 27, whenever DEP gets around to adopting the rule, then they increase their pumping up to 1.5 million gallons a day. Well, that 500,000 gallons a day difference between 1.5 and 1 million, that would be considered a new use Group B. That would be something that happened after rule adoption, which also gets treated differently. So we have 3 different categories of water use, but one single permit can fall into multiple categories. Next slide. So as I said, everyone in that big area on the map that we showed is going to have to be evaluated to determine their impact on the MFL recovery point, and if necessary, the required offset associated with the permit. That's a good thing. We need to get those numbers. What our concern is that the state agencies are relying on modeling and information submitted by the applicant, not actual pumping and flow data. And I think folks who have been involved in the consumptive use permitting process for some time will tell you, as I certainly believe, that the use of modeling is a big part of what got us into this problem. Models are in large ways black boxes, and if they can easily be manipulated to give the results you want, especially as you see later when we have minimum thresholds for having to do anything. So it's really important that we get this right. It's really important that we have an accurate gauge on how much each permit is impacting the springs so that we can be sure to effectively offset them. Next slide. So here's how existing uses, those uses that happened between 2014 and 2018, are going to be treated. So all existing uses are required to offset their proportional share of the base condition water use within 20 years of the effective date of the rule. And again, the base condition water use is the average quantity of groundwater used between 2014 and 2018. And DEP has created a formula for how you do this. It's a pretty simple formula, although math is weird. But essentially what they're doing is they're going to look at how much the permittee's flow reduces, the permittee's withdrawal reduces flow at the compliance points. Then they're going to look at the overall reduction in flow at the compliance points. And that final number is what we need to make up to restore the flow. So, just as an example, if we have a water use permit that is reducing flow at a compliance point by 0.5 cubic feet per second, and the total impact from all pumping from 2014 to 2018 is 25 cubic feet per second, and the deficit is 10 cubic feet per second, the formula would be 0.5 divided by 25 and parens times 10. So that permittee would need to reduce their uses by 0.2 cubic feet per second. And as long as all of the information that DEP collects is accurate, and as long as the permittees are actually required to reduce their pumping by that amount, that is an effective way to address the existing uses as of 2014 to 2018. But we have to make sure those things actually happen, or it will just get worse. Next slide. So this is the breakdown based on how great the impact of the withdrawal is. And this is a good thing. This is a triage system, right? We need to address the worst first. I worked for several years on that 2016 bill that really DEP is implementing a decade later here. And if I had a dollar for every time a legislator said worst first, FSC would be fully funded. So it's a good plan. What it requires is that existing users with an impact greater than 0.1 cubic feet per second must submit an offset plan within 2 years of rule adoption. Existing users with an impact greater than 0.01 but less than 0.1 must submit an offset plan within 10 years of adoption. Where it gets questionable is exempting any users with an impact of 0.01 cubic feet per second. Next slide. And the reason that is controversial is, again, because one, we do not know how many permits are out there under that 0.01 cubic feet per second threshold. We've asked DEP for that information, haven't received it yet. If there's enough permits, under that, it could make accomplishing the MFL very, very difficult. The other issue, of course, is once you put a marker like that down, then you're giving permitted users something to go for, right? So now there's a place where you want your modeling to end up so that you don't have to take any actions, and that is concerning. For those new uses group A from 2019 to rule adoption, and remember, this is both new permits that were issued from between 2019 and potentially 2026, but it's also increases in water use from existing permits after 2018. So these permittees and applicants are going to be required to offset 100% of their authorized use in excess of the base condition water use within 20 years of adoption, unless granted a temporary allocation. And for any permits after 2018, that base condition water use is 0. So basically what that means is if you have a permit after 2018, you're going to have to offset the entire impact of that permit in order to meet the MFL. However, and we'll talk a lot more about this later, while it's good to have to submit a plan, and while it's good to tell folks that they need to offset, for both existing users and new users group A, no offset is required until 2046 at the earliest, no matter when the permit was issued. So DEP is kicking the can down the road here, literally as far as the law would allow, and much further than the folks who worked and wrote on this bill ever would have imagined. Next slide. For new uses group B, and again, these are going to be post-rule adoption. We don't know when rule adoption will be. We thought it would be 2019 and then 2020 and 21, 22, 23. We were told 24. We hope for 25. We're now at 26. But whenever they do get around to adopting these rules, all of these permits will also be required to offset their full impact but within 10 years of rule adoption. Unfortunately, the new uses type B section, I think is still in the works. As it's currently drafted, it doesn't even make enough sense for me to really analyze it. Permits under this class, under the draft rule, would have to offset their impact within 10 years of rule adoption. And considering this is for permits that could come in post 10 years, it's really not clear how that would be possible. Another issue with this is that the trigger to have to submit plans for this section is upon application, where there are applicants who will increase their permittees who will increase their water use would never have to come in for an application. So I think DEP is trying to craft a more protective rule here for those new uses, Group B, which is something we've asked for, so we would certainly support. But right now, they're not there yet. Right now, this rule still has a lot of flaws, a lot of concerns. And hopefully, those will be addressed through our comments and as DEP continues to work to improve the rule. Next slide. So once you figured out, okay, I have a permit, this is the impact at those compliance points, which are set of the river, not the springs, but that's where they are. You have to submit an offset plan, right? This is your plan as the permittee or as the applicant of how you're going to offset those impacts at the compliance point, right? So this is really where the rubber meets the road. This is where we have to have the right projects. We have to have the right permitting. We have to be dealing with existing permits or we'll never get there. So essentially what the plan says is that everyone who is a new user Group A or an existing user has 20 years from the moment the plan is adopted to implement those offsets. What that means is that if they don't work, which there's no way that every project is going to work as well as we want it to. It would be great if it did, but we know from experience that that's not the way it goes. We know from experience that projects that we think are going to cost $10 million end up costing $50 million and not being nearly as effective. It's part of the problem with relying on these big infrastructure projects as DEP and the water management districts like to do. If we were to just retire permits and enforce the laws of consumptive use permitting, we know that works. If you reduce the amount of pumping, you increase flow. But when you get into a bunch of very complicated and questionable infrastructure projects, it can become very hard to actually accomplish the goals that you want. And that's the problem with the rule, is that while it's based on offset projects to make up the flow, there's no new restrictions on permitting or water use. And because we have a 20-year deadline for offsetting that, the only thing this rule guarantees, the only thing, is that the Santa Fe and Ichetucknee Rivers will be worse off after the rule is adopted. That's it. We may see improvements down the road. That's all hypothetical. What is certain is that pumping will increase and flow will decrease in this rivers as a result of the rule, right? And the fact that we have a rule that's designed to stop significant harm, that's only going to make that significant harm worse, that's the major problem that we're dealing with today. The MFL is really a step backwards from current law. Under the current law, the districts can deny consumptive use permits for causing harm. It's a fact that every consumptive use permit they issue causes significant harm because the river's already experiencing significant harm. And what this rule does is it takes away the power of the districts, a power they haven't used but could and should, to deny consumptive use permits for causing harm. Finally, the offset plans lack nearly every detail required under state law. If you go look at 373.8054, you'll see there's a whole laundry list of things these plans need to include. DEP will tell you those are coming. They're going to have to come, but it's really hard to evaluate a plan when you don't have the required information under state law to do so. Next slide. So there's three methods for offsetting impacts. The number one is to implement, and this is the one I think we'll be seeing the most of, is implementation of a water resource or water supply development project. These are based on modeling by the applicant, and they can be a private project or more likely contributing to a government-sponsored project. There's nothing in the rule that actually guarantees that it will be the permittees and the water users that are paying for these projects and not taxpayers. And based on what we've seen over the last 10 years, it's much more likely to be us, the taxpayers, who are paying for this than it will be the applicants. And when you look at these projects, and there's a bunch of good examples, the project to pump water to Keystone may be the best. Sometimes the cost will run 10 times what they're supposed to. The idea that our state agencies are going to tell an applicant, hey, you need to contribute $500,000 to this project, and then come back 10 years later and say, sorry, we were wrong, give us another $4.5 million. That won't happen. So the ineffectiveness of this rule, the reliance on water resource and water supply development projects, that's not only ineffective, but it's going to come back on all of us. And also, some of those water supply development projects are really scary. A couple of years ago, the Suwannee River Water Management District floated the idea of pumping water from the Suwannee River all the way to the Ichetucknee Basin, basically building a water treatment plant in the woods somewhere, cleaning that water from the Suwannee because it's too polluted to put on the ground, and then dumping it on the ground in the Ichetucknee so it will refill the aquifer. They proposed that at about $500 million. I imagine it would actually be much more expensive than that. But that's a plan that gets proposed as opposed to just following the law and not handing out every consumptive use permit that gets applied for within the district. The second option is one that we've pushed for and really what should be the standard, and that's the retirement of an existing water use permit. We need to move our water into more economically effective and efficient means. And part of that's going to mean retiring existing water use permits that are only able to really be profitable because of the negative externalities, right? It's real easy to make a profit when taxpayers are paying all your bills. But that's not a way to run an effective government or an effective district. So what we need to be doing is we need to be shutting down permits. We need to be shutting down some permits and moving them to higher value uses. And the way that an applicant or a permittee could do that is by buying out an existing permit, shutting it down, having that water go into reservation, and using that water to make up for their impact at the MFL compliance points. That is what we need to be focusing on. That is the one real way that we could guarantee that we would restore the Santa Fe and Ichetucknee Rivers. And number 3 is other means to reduce impact in MFL recovery point. We have asked DEP what that means. They haven't answered. But whatever it is, if it's not retiring existing water use permits and it's not creating more flow, I have a hard time believing it's going to work. Next slide. So what about enforcement and accountability? Because at the end of the day, that's what this all comes down to. I say all the time that Florida has great laws, and we really do. It's one of the reasons that the Florida Springs Council focuses so much on litigation, because we have really good laws on the books. They've been there for a long time. They just need to be implemented. So what enforcement is there if a permittee fails to offset their impact during the permit duration? Nothing. So if a permittee says, hey, I'm going to do this project, I'm going to contribute money to a project, I'm going to retire a consumptive use permit, and then they don't do it. Or, they say, hey, our modeling says it's going to have X impact, but really it falls well short of X, there is no enforcement. The permittee just gets to propose a new project to be completed at some point in the future. And as I said earlier, in situations where permittees are contributing to public projects, the idea that the district's going to come back or DEP is going to come back and say, hey, we told you this project was going to do X amount of benefit for Y dollars, and we were wrong, so now you need to contribute more money. I find a hard time believing that's going to happen. So what accountability is there if a permittee fails to offset their impacts for the entire duration of their permit? So you have a permit, you come in, you say, hey, here's my impact. You promise you're going to offset it, and you don't do it. And then you come in for a new permit. Well, under DEP's rule, that's fine. The permittee can simply request a temporary allocation of water for up to 5 years based on their own due diligence. Not the due diligence of the district, not the due diligence of DEP, but the applicant just saying, hey, I need this. I think it's a good idea, so you should do it. That is, there's not going to be any way to have an effective rule without enforcement and without accountability. And as DEP's rule is written today, it lacks both of those things. Next slide. So the last part of the rule focuses on water conservation. You could have an entire webinar exclusively on the water conservation portion of this rule. I can't stress how important water conservation is. If we don't do more to conserve water, especially with our big public utilities, which have, besides phosphate, by far the largest, by a factor of 10, consumptive use permits in this area, we're not going to be able to chip away at each individual small permit enough to accomplish the goals that we have here. So we have to have a real strong water conservation policy. Unfortunately, the water conservation policy in the draft rule is incredibly weak. It has this loophole that we see over and over again in DEP's rules, where environmentally, technically, and economically feasible. That allows the applicant, the utility, the permittee, that's their decision. They get to decide whether or not water conservation is environmentally, technically, and economically feasible. We need to wipe those words not only out of this rule, we need to wipe those words out of all rules. We have to do this, right? This has to happen. It's state law. So they shouldn't have a choice as to whether or not they follow the law and contribute their part. Water conservation should be mandatory. Second, we have to allow local governments to adopt more protective irrigation restrictions. Go back. Take the slide back one, please. Okay. We have to allow local governments to adopt more protective irrigation restrictions. Right now, local governments are essentially limited to the state minimum. We have to do better. You know, there's places like Alachua County specifically that really wants to take the reins on water conservation, that wants to really tighten down and make sure that, you know, protect the Santa Fe River and protect the springs. And, you know, at the very least, if DEP won't do their job, they need to give the local governments the ability to do so. The current residential per capita goal within the plan is 75 gallons per day. That is not nearly enough. That's a good place to start, but we're talking 20 years from now. You know, we need to be working to get that number down as low as possible. And it might be that there are different numbers for different areas depending on the amount of single family homes versus multifamily homes. But that number there, that residential per capita, that includes multifamily homes that are not watering their lawns. That includes apartment complexes, you know, things like that, where just because of the nature of not having a lawn to water, just because of the smaller footprint, the folks are well below 75 gallons per day right now. So what it's really doing is it's giving a big leeway to the folks with larger homes, to yards, to continue to irrigate and waste water. We need to require outdoor water use for high volume users, or audits for high volume users. Right now in the draft rule, that appears to be optional. You know, for those top 10 or 20% of property owners who are using, you know, more water than all the rest of us, we need the audits, right? A lot of times that can be leaks. Those can be things that can be addressed, but folks want to do it on their own. So we need to provide them that resource by requiring to have someone come out and do a water audit and determine, you know, why are you using 5 times more water than your neighbor? And finally, we need to prohibit new private irrigation wells. One of the best things about this rule as it's currently drafted is that it does have language that could prohibit some new private irrigation wells. Unfortunately, the way that language is currently written, it has loopholes that would make it likely that anybody who wanted to get around it probably could. And we have to tighten that up. You know, those private irrigation wells, they're not part of any consumptive use permit, right? So when you turn on your shower, unless you have your own well, but if you're part of a public water supply, you turn on your shower, that's part of the consumptive use permit. That's from the public utility. You know, if you live in Gainesville Regional Utilities has about a 30 million gallon per day permit. And when you turn on your shower, you're using part of that 30 million gallons a day. You run your dishwasher, your washing machine, that's part of that 30 million gallons a day. But when you have a private irrigation well, that's not counted, right? And we know that, you know, anywhere from 30, 40, 50% of residential water use is in those irrigation wells, or is from lawn watering. So in situations where you have lots and lots of private irrigation wells, unpermitted and unmetered, you know, those could be having a very significant impact on the springs and rivers. So that doesn't mean people can't water their lawns. I would say, unless you have to, you probably shouldn't be watering your lawn. But what it does mean is that you should be paying for that water just like we pay for all the other water. There's nothing super special about the water that comes out of your irrigation well compared to the water that comes, you use for your dishwasher. It's all the same water. It all comes directly from the springs and rivers, and it should all be treated the same. And that's a really important loophole we need to close. Next slide. So what are our major concerns? And we're going to get into the letter writing and the questions part of this in a few minutes. But what I would say is that these are the big things. These are the things that we have to change if we want to see a restored Santa Fe and Ichetucknee River in our lifetime. So first of all, riverine MFLs are not protective of the springs and based on out-of-date data, right? We have to make sure that the MFLs, just as the law says, are for the springs, because that's called the Florida Springs and Aquifer Protection Act. We need to protect the springs, and we need to make sure that whenever DEP adopts the law, that it's based on the absolute most recent data, right? If you go back and you remember how we showed those three different points, we had two that were in recovery and one that was shown to be meeting its MFL. Well, when they do that analysis to determine your impact, they do it based on the compliance point that you're having the largest effect on, right? So by treating that one gauge as being in compliance, which it was in 2022, if it was not in compliance at the time when they adopt the MFL, whenever that is, and the recovery plan, that could change everything dramatically. It could change who has to reduce and by how much. And really, it goes the other way too, right? We don't know. For all we know, another gauge that we think is in recovery now could actually be meeting the MFL, right? And that would have a huge difference, right? We would be requiring permitted users to make, changes and to do offsets that aren't actually necessary when we're not addressing the ones that need to be. So the most basic thing, you need to follow the law, you need to use the most accurate data. Second, the MFL, and I'm gonna take questions later, but not only the presentation, but the slides will be available for anyone who wants them following the webinar. The second is it doesn't include the requirements in Florida law. Right. At the minimum, this plan, we need to have the requirements in Florida law. We need to have the details in order to be able to really assess it and give, know whether or not it's going to work. Third, we can't rely solely on modeling and self-reporting. We need this to be professional, right? Self-reporting isn't enough. We need the district to go in. We need to make sure that they are truthing all of the things that they're getting. We need to make sure that the models are accurate. They should let the environmental community into those models. They should let us understand what they're doing. They should make it as transparent as possible. Third, and most importantly, as I said earlier, this does nothing to address the root cause of the problem, which is that we're over allocating our water resources. We're handing out consumptive use permits that cause significant harm in violation of state law. And we can mess around with alternative water supply projects and water resource development projects and whatever the heck other means is supposed to be, but we're never going to accomplish our goals unless we allocate less water, unless we begin to cut back on permits, we begin to deny permits, and we begin to, follow the law. Again, Florida has good laws. We just have to follow them. Next. The plan gives permittees 20 years or more to complete the projects that offset their harm to the springs and the rivers, while allowing things to continue to get worse during that time. For those of you who have been following FSC for a while, you might remember our Basin Management Action Plan challenge. So we challenged a rule that DEP adopted for water quality, saying this rule doesn't come close to being able to restore the springs. And largely DEP's response was adaptive management, right? We know that this isn't good, but hey, we're going to come back every 5 years and we're going to change the rule and we're going to see what happens and we're going to adapt, right? So we will adjust. All of a sudden, when it comes to recovery strategies, you'll never hear adaptive management. Adaptive management has been thrown completely out the window. They are proposing one rule, 20 years. You get the whole 20 years before you have to do anything. And if it doesn't work, it's us and the rivers and the springs that will suffer. Next, no accountability or enforcement. Sorry, not next slide. Next point. No accountability or enforcement for permittees who fail to offset their impacts. There should be no temporary allocations. You should get one shot at this. I mean, If you're having to reduce your impact, that means that you were granted a consumptive use permit that causes harm. You don't even have a right to that permit. And now we're going to give you a temporary allocation to do more harm, even after you haven't done the things that you're required, right? It's called permits for a reason. You know, it's not a right. Folks don't have a right to withdraw 1 million gallons a day from our aquifer. It's a permit. It's something you have to be permitted to do. But permitting doesn't work if you never deny a permit, right? I mean, that's what it comes down to. So at this point, we've already dug the hole. It's time to stop digging. And that's what this rule really fails to realize. It doesn't stop digging. It doesn't get us out of the problem. It says, let's keep digging now. And let's hope that someone later comes in 20 years from now and fills in this hole. And that's not an effective plan. And it's weak on public water supply and conservation, and it's just, you know, completely full of loopholes that make the water conservation measures voluntary when they should be mandatory. You know, it's kind of part of this Ponzi scheme, for lack of a better term, that we see in environmental protection. You know, the utilities will say, well, it's not economically feasible. We don't want to pass the expense back on to our ratepayers. But then it just gets passed on to all the taxpayers in Florida, right? We're paying for it one way or another. Doesn't it make sense that the folks who are doing the damage should be the one paying the cost, not everyone? Next slide. So the big picture, and you know, this is why we're focusing on this, is that because DEP has delayed rule adoption for a decade, and because they've proposed a weak rule that will never get us to restored springs in our lifetimes, and that's unacceptable. You know, I started working on the law that led to this rule in 2013. The idea that we won't even know if it's successful by 2046 is ridiculous. You know, you'll hear a lot of people say, you know, it took us a long time to get in this situation. It's going to take us a long time to get out. And that's true, but we need to be making progress the whole way. We need to have 5-year goals, 10-year goals, just as the law requires, to make sure that we're on the right track. As this goes, there is essentially nothing we can do for 20 years if DEP goes forward with this rule. Next slide. So here are our recommendations. These are the things that we have told DEP, and we will continue to say in our written comments that need to happen for this to be an effective rule. We need an MFL for each outstanding Florida Springs using the best available information. We need to determine impacts and offsets from actual water use and data. We have to reduce the timeline to complete offsets. 20 years is completely unacceptable. After they submit the plan, permittees should be granted 5 years with a 5-year extension if it is in the best interest of the public. I'm not making that up. That's actually in state law. You won't see it in the rule, but when you read the state law, that's what it says. You need to get it done, and then if you can't get it done, we'll give you a 5-year extension if it's in the best interest of the public. And the permittee does not get to decide if it's in the best interest of the public. It should be our state agencies making that determination, and they should have our best interests, not the water user's best interest at heart. Next slide. Existing users who commit to an offset project but fail to complete it should have their permits reduced. It's just that simple. If you have an impact that you need to offset, you promise to do it and you don't, your permit gets reduced. Then the offset's achieved. You know, you'd have to do it your way. At the point when you haven't done that, the district needs to come in, DEP needs to come in. They need to be the grown-up in the room and and reduce the permits. No permit should be issued after rule adoption that impacts an MFL recovery point. It's kind of unbelievable that we have to say that. But we do. We have a rule here that says, hey, even after we've adopted a recovery strategy, we're going to keep handing out permits that significantly harm the river and springs. That can't be the result of after 10 years of this rulemaking effort. And if a permittee has failed to complete a required offset project for the entire duration of their permit, they should not be able to get a new permit until that offset is complete. Next slide. Water conservation requirements should be strengthened, loopholes eliminated. Local governments should be given the ability to adopt stricter irrigation regulations, and new irrigation wells should be prohibited in the MFL area and in compliance rules to close the current loopholes. Next slide. So We thought that the comments for this rule were going to be due on August 30th. We believe now that a notice will come out tomorrow that will delay that until September 30th, which gives us a lot more time to do this. You can submit your comments to that email address right there. You'll see that from DEP notices. You can't and shouldn't try to go through everything that we have in this webinar. We wrote a comment letter to DEP on the last draft of this that was not public, and it ran in excess of 14 pages. We don't need everyone writing 14-page letters, but we do need everyone to write, right? And there's really two things that you need to get across. One is, why do you care? Right? Like, why is this an issue that matters to you? And you don't have to be a riparian landowner on the Santa Fe for it to matter to you. You don't have to paddle the Santa Fe. Our springs belong to all of us. We're the Florida Springs Council. Springs are important to everyone. It's not a NIMBY issue. It is the window to our aquifer. It's what feeds our most important rivers. It's what provides habitat. If you're on this webinar, you have plenty of standing in my eyes to write DEP comments and let them know how you feel. Second, focus on a few specific concerns and recommendations, the ones that speak to you, the ones that you understand. If water conservation is your thing, focus on the water conservation element. If it's the timeline that you think is the most atrocious, talk about that. If you are like me and you feel like we need to stop handing out consumptive use permits to anyone who applies for one, despite the significant harm going on to the rivers, focus on that. But don't just try to copy what we have here and submit it all. There are lots of experts that are going to be writing with those really, really detailed recommendations. What we need you to do is let DEP know that you care and that you're paying attention and that you're going to hold them responsible if they don't follow the law and they don't implement these rules to protect our rivers. Next slide. Yep, so there it is. So now we're going to open it up for questions. I know we're about an hour in, but I want to take as many questions as possible. So, Brenda, Chloe, bring them on, and I will do my best. Is emailing and physical letter writing equally effective? For agency rules, I think emailing is the way to go. If you're talking about your local legislator, a handwritten letter is really important. If you're talking about your city council, your county commission, your elected officials, I think there's evidence that handwritten letters go further. With these rule letters, it makes it a lot easier to get them into the system, to make them available to everyone. Like, we'll do a public records request to get all the letters. It's a lot easier when they're submitted via email. And in reality, even if you mail it, it may not, it should show up, but you're not guaranteed as much as if you send a letter to that rulemaking. So this is a situation where I would strongly suggest you go with email. All right, is that the only question? All right, well, I'm just going to grab some then. I don't know what happened to the support. Here we go. In your opinion, why is DEP not seriously trying to improve the quality of springs and rivers? I would just be guessing. They have the law on their side. They have the power to do it. They have the resources. They're just choosing not to. And at some level, not at the staff level, not the people that we deal with, but at some level, it's lack of political will, and it's captured by regulated industries. And again, that's not speaking to the on-the-ground, employees. A lot of the on-the-ground employees are wonderful, and they're doing the absolute best job they can in a really difficult situation. But you get to a certain level where it stops being about the resources and it starts being about the politics. that's how we end up where we are. The staff at the district has some wonderful staff people who would love to do more to protect the rivers. I firmly believe that. Same thing at DEP. If they had the ability to do better, they would, but their hands are being tied. All right, I'm just going to grab some here. Is the gauge at Fort White at Hollingsworth? I don't know the answer to that. But if you go to the document, you can see exactly where it's at. But it's essentially at Fort White. Joanne Trimbley says, I thought irrigation water was reclaimed from sewage treatment. So that's going to be those public water supply, right? So like I was saying, like some folks, you're getting your irrigation water from your local utility. Like that does happen. And at times, in some places, that water can be from reclaim, which has its own concerns because it's higher in nitrogen. But if you don't fertilize, that can be okay. What we're really concerned about are the private wells, right? So this is someone who's just, and a lot of us have these. I mean, a lot of people in my neighborhood here in Jacksonville have them. You're sinking your own well down that you're using exclusively to water your yard, right? So you are using kind of the highest quality, best water we have for a purpose that is, really something we need to get away from. Joanne also says the term recovery is misleading. I completely agree with you. I think that was the intention of the folks who wrote the law. It's clearly not the intention of the state agencies who are implementing them. Jane Hepting, should we ask the federal government to take over enforcement of the Clean Water Act? I think that's something we have to begin to seriously consider, which is not something that I would have said a few years ago. If we had state agencies and a governor and politicians who wanted to protect our water resources, it would be much better to have those programs at the state level. Unfortunately, when you look at the percent of our springs, rivers, and lakes that are polluted, the decline in flows, the toxic chemicals going into our waters, and our state's refusal to do anything about it, I do think it's time to start thinking about, other options. It would be nice if the state could handle it, but if they can't, I think it is very clear that the state is not implementing the requirements of the Clean Water Act as they should be. And it's a complicated issue. If you look back at when Florida actually assumed Clean Water Act responsibilities, a lot of the rules that have since been added onto the Clean Water Act were not in effect. So I do think, there is a case that Florida's water quality program has deviated significantly from what the federal law requires, particularly when it comes to things like access to the courts. Do y'all list Florida Springs friendly and non-friendly elected officials somewhere? So we're a 501c3, so we do not do electioneering. I will say that the thing you can't do is vote on party line. As someone who lobbies quite a bit in Tallahassee during session, this is not a blue, red, left, right, Republican, Democrat issue. Some of the best water champions that I've worked with in the legislature in the last 10 years, as a matter of fact, most of them were in fact Republicans. I have seen the other side, the Democratic side, sell us out many, many times. At the same time, the Republicans are the majority party. So you can't alleviate them from responsibility. What I like to say is, if you get a chance to talk to your candidates, ask them questions, ask them to make commitments. ask them to, what their position is. A lot of these issues are pretty cut and dry, and follow the votes. It's a little bit hard because, again, there isn't a whole lot of differentiation between how Republicans and Democrats vote on environmental issues. But follow the votes, and I've still yet to meet the politician who publicly doesn't support clean water, yet here we are. So you kind of have to look past that too. It's hard to do, but I would say, if you do the research, look at the big issues that are coming up. We've got election season coming, right? We have this crazy proposal that Chloe talked about a minute ago to privatize and commercialize our state parks. Anyone who supports that, anyone who doesn't strongly oppose that, is probably not a candidate that deserves an environmentalist's vote. Anyone who doesn't think that we need to do better, right? Anyone who's talking to you about how great things are, that's a big red flag. You hear someone saying that, we're doing great, look at all the money we're spending. Yeah, they're spending our taxpayer money as things get worse. That's a red flag. So to some extent, you need to look through it. And also there are groups that do make recommendations. I believe Sierra Club in some areas make recommendations. I really encourage you all to go to the Big Bend Environmental Forum is an awesome resource for those folks up near Tallahassee. And we have these legislative conferences where everybody from a certain county, all the state senators and House members after the election, they all get together in one room to take comments. That's a great time to go and express, the environmental. I know it's after the election, but that's a great time to go and express your views. Rick Lenise asks, when denying permits have a direct negative impact on new housing and industrial development? Do we need to improve quality and flow without negatively impacting new developments? That's the system that we're in, and that's why we need to be expiring permits. If the best use of water is for a new development, and I question whether it is, but if it is, then we need to make sure that water is available, right? We're borrowing from Peter to pay Paul over and over and over again. So, I think we need to think less about the new developments, and we need to think more about the folks who have been there, the folks who are here now, right? Growth for the sake of growth isn't a positive thing. You have to realize that, our springs, this is it. You look at the Santa Fe, Sewanee, kind of down, into Marion, into Citrus. This is the greatest collection of natural springs in the world, bar none. We have to protect them. And if that means that people can't build inappropriate housing developments right on top of our spring sheds, that's okay. Just like, the Grand Canyon has a negative impact on housing and industrial development there. Some places just aren't appropriate for it. And the truth is we need to do a better job. If we were building smart, if we were following smart growth principles, if we were going with native landscaping, if we were getting rid of irrigation wells, if we had stronger fertilizer rules, if we had all of these things, then maybe we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in. But approving just the same old housing developments that have got us into this situation, can't be the answer to get us out of it. Do sustainable development do better with water consumption? Yeah, in a lot of ways, there's lots of things that you can mean by sustainable development. But those basic things that I was saying right there, if you plant, Florida natives, you don't have to water. And we know that a lot of, our residential water use is coming from that lawn watering. But it's not just that, right? There's Florida Gold Star. There's all of these programs to reduce per capita use, both outside the house and inside the house. And, really smart development incorporates all of those. And we've seen it work, right? This isn't like some theoretical thing. They did this. They did it 20, 30 years ago in the Tampa Bay area. When you really, all we're asking DEP to do is to go back to what they did 20, 30 years ago. Cut back on permits, make water reservations, force conservation, right? The way they did it back then was by having a huge bucket of money they could pull from. Unfortunately, Governor Scott undid that. Governor Scott forced all the districts to significantly lower their ad valorem tax rates, to spend down their reserves, to get rid of the brain trust, to put a situation where we are today. But at the end of the day, these things really do come down to money. And if we had the ability to do the things today that they were doing in the Tampa Bay water wars, we wouldn't be in this situation. But unfortunately, the political will and the expertise to do those things doesn't appear to exist anymore. I am with you, Rick. If I were king for a day, I would also be putting a freeze on all further development. This is not seriously address water use. I think, and not only development, but agriculture. It's really both sides, and we have to address both. And we need to make sure that when it comes to agriculture, especially, that we're providing state funding to make sure that agricultural producers can convert to water-saving technologies, without driving them completely out of business. There's tons of improvements that could be made, especially in the Santa Fe area when it comes to agricultural water conservation. And we just need to really, require those projects, but also to fund them. Chloe mentioned also earlier that the Springs project list came out. There's not one water conservation project. There's like 95 projects. They're going to spend somewhere more than $60 million. There's not even one on the list that they could fund if they wanted to. And yes, there are alternative water supply projects. There definitely are, right? So our state agencies aren't prioritizing it. They're not prioritizing water conservation, and that's the reason it's not happening. All right. I want to thank everyone. Any other questions? I want to thank everyone very much for tuning in. This presentation will be available on Facebook and YouTube. Please share it with anyone you think might be interested. We will also put a link to the slides on our website and find a way to make sure that everyone has access to that. I know that these, hopefully we want these slides to help you with your letter writing. So thank you all very much, and appreciate you being here, and everyone have a great evening.